Hello, my name is Dr. Mike Searcy and I'm the President of Communication Resource Consulting and Professor of Communication Studies. Today I want to initiate part one of our series of discussions in intercultural communication. I want to talk about the importance of intercultural communication, essentially the why. I want to talk a little bit about the global community, the growing domestic diversity here in the United States, and U.S. immigration, technology, etc., etc. There are 6 areas impacting our life that are important for us to answer that question, why? Why intercultural communication? Why can't we just deal with the people around us specifically? I think those 6 areas are important for us to pay attention to because they affect our lives in ways that we don't often recognize. Those 6 areas are: first, international conflict and our own security within our own borders. Competition for natural resources such as water, food, energy supplies, oil, etc. Competition for jobs. As the world seems to be becoming a smaller place, people become more mobile. They can go anywhere for certain jobs, or the jobs can go anywhere with respect to the economies that it might cost the company or the organization less to get that work fulfilled. Environmental challenges are certainly ahead of us, as well as healthcare issues, and one of the things I think we ought to pay attention to as well are population shifts. So let's look at that interconnected global community for a moment, because we are a product of growth in world trade. Think about that for a moment. Growth in world trade, as more and more countries are actually trading with each other, we have to become more connected. And as a consequence, we have to learn more about the cultures with which we're connecting. Improvements in telecommunications. You know, it used to be that letters would take weeks to get from one part of the country to the other, let alone months to get from one country to another, especially when there was an ocean involved. Today, that's almost instantaneous. And how often are we able to just pick up a telephone or get onto the computer and get onto Skype and deal with instantaneous communication? Telecommunications brings that interconnected global community much, much closer. That interconnectivity is there. We've got to recognize it. And how about the ease of data storage and transfer? It's very easy for me to send files, whether it's PowerPoint presentations, whether it's encrypted data, whether it's entire movies and packages of whatever it might be. The ease of transferability is just phenomenal, unheard of 20 years ago. Travel's also become very easy. When we talk about the increased business and leisure travel and the ease in which we're able to buy a ticket, get on a plane, and I could be in China or the Philippines, or I could be in Saudi Arabia inside of 10, 15, 18 hours. The ease of that travel has become phenomenally easy. The interconnected global community is also a big factor when we talk about global megacorporations, because these megacorporations continue to expand and in some cases are much more powerful or much more independent than actual governments within countries. And actions, processes involving the entire world result in a worldwide in scope, right? Because no matter what the actions are, depending upon who's making them, if they hit the news, you might as well consider it global. Because if they hit the news, it's on the internet, right? And if it's on the internet, then the fact of the matter is it's searchable and people will indeed find it. So aside from the interconnected global diversity that we've got to deal with, we're also talking about growing domestic diversity. The U.S. population is undergoing dramatic change, and all we have to do is look around us and we know that. No longer is this country in the United States a product solely of Western European immigrants. We have people from all over the world. Minorities now represent 35% and growing of the U.S. population. The growth of that cultural generation gap is becoming greater and greater, because as younger generations move in from with immigration issues from different countries, the increase in 45 to 64 years old, the older population, that particular cohort is getting greater and greater as well. The younger generation growth is largely a product of Hispanic and Asian births. We're talking about not only an age, but a cultural gap that needs to be addressed. And if there isn't another reason why, we need to seriously consider the question of why we need to pay attention to intercultural communication and multicultural cooperation within our own country. I don't know if there's a greater reason than that right there. New immigrants are now locating in the suburbs. They're not all going into major cities. The news media will dwell on issues of crime and illegal arrivals taking U.S. jobs. We know this. What does that do except for promulgate fear and ethnocentricity and other issues dealing with the fact that we are who we are, and if there's bad news being portrayed on the news media, isn't that what's always going on? Or we'd like to think so because we often are a victim to our own propaganda. And yet, immigrants have made significant contributions to the economy and the U.S. welfare. Inventions and things like this were not all created by the settlers that have come to the United States from Western Europe. Another reason why we need to pay attention to multicultural communication and intercultural communication in a multicultural world is that technology has a greater influence on us. Technology has enabled ordinary individuals to cheaply and quickly organize themselves around a common interest, ideology, or social cause. Look at the minor political parties that are having significant impact around the world. We talk about the rule of the minority. Maybe if that's truly happening, it's happening because they have access to technology and they know how to use it. The internet and cell phones allow people to exchange ideas everywhere. You can't walk any city in the United States anymore without being suspect to being recorded by someone else's cell phone if they find you interesting or some sort of point of interest. Technology is providing a means to reaffirm and extend cultural awareness, identity, and practices. We have a chance because of technology to constantly kind of connect with people, even if we happen to move away from our own heritage and our own home cultures. We have the ability to stand out within new cultures, recognizing our technology and getting involved and staying involved, because that technology that we have will allow us to connect. And technology is bringing about more polarized society, isn't it? Think about this. If I'm focusing strictly on my community that I've created or I've attached myself to by way of technology, and the people around me might perhaps have very strong opinions in opposite directions, it's easy for me to look at and say, well, I'm this way, you're that way, and I know that there are people that think my way, and I'm going to hold out with them, rather than sometimes figuring out how I'm going to get along with the people directly in front of me. Sometimes that can cause more problems. So let's look at some of our definitions, shall we? What is intercultural communication? Intercultural communication involves interaction between people whose cultural perceptions and symbol systems differ enough to alter the communication event. And symbol systems. Remember that meaning in communication does not lie within words. Meaning lies within people. Because language in and of itself is a set of symbols. Who determines what those symbols mean? People do. There's no universal dictionary of all the meanings of everything we say and do. If, for example, I say to you, hey, how are you doing today? And your response to me is, eh. You're not going to find eh in the dictionary, are we? Let alone are we going to find what the meaning is. And yet that meaning is somehow clear within most cultures, that eh means perhaps I'm feeling so-so, or I'm just okay. But with respect to symbols, somebody has to have actually put that meaning or attached that meaning to that. So when we talk about intercultural communication, we're talking about people with different symbol systems having to figure out how to communicate with each other for mutual understanding. So when we talk about intercultural communication involving interaction between people whose cultural perceptions and symbol systems differ enough to alter the communication event, we're talking about altering meaning, aren't we? And that's important for us to pay attention to. Another definition that we want to pay attention to is dominant culture. A dominant group is characteristic of all cultures. And this collective of people possesses those instruments of power that allow it to set the broad societal agenda the majority of others will commonly follow. What am I talking about here? A dominant culture is that group that somehow has control of the features of society. Now in the United States, that's often still considered the Western European immigrant population that came here generations now ago that have control often of the political process and the power and money. Is that changing? It is, but not quickly. So in the United States, oftentimes the dominant culture is still considered that particular subset. How about CoCulture? CoCultures are groups or social communities exhibiting perceptions, values, beliefs, communicative behaviors, and social practices that are sufficiently different from other groups and communities and different from the dominant culture, but they live within the same geographic area that the dominant culture does. Okay? CoCulture is a relatively new term. Not more than 15 years ago or so, they used to actually refer to that as a subculture. But when we talk about CoCultures, we're talking about cultures that exist within the overall society with the dominant culture. They may not be the ones that are controlling things, but they do indeed and can indeed be identified as a subset or as a coexisting set with their own values, beliefs, and perceptions. So who is society? What is society? Here we're talking about the comprehensive, organized human interactions. Okay? The overall human interactions that happen within a culture itself, such as a social structure, organizations, institutions, and the like. Here I'm talking about families. I'm talking about churches. I'm talking about groups and schools and government organizations. And I'm talking about any time of a structure where people get together. We're talking about society. Okay. When venturing into a new culture, as a consequence, this is what all immigrants do, especially when they come to the United States, and we have varying perceptions on what that means. But the culture contributes to feeling of familiarity, right? Because there is a common language. You come to the United States, at least depending upon where you are, you're going to hear common language or languages. There are collective values. Within any culture that you intend to go into, you will start to recognize various values that are indeed collective and common throughout the entire group. And there are common bonds. Whether they be organizational, structural, family, there are common bonds that can be identified within every culture. Culture shock, therefore, is the process of adapting to that new culture. So what are the phases of culture shock? First, we have that exhilaration stage. You get into the culture, you're filled with excitement, hopefulness, and even a feeling of euphoria. This is exciting stuff, new adventure. The individual anticipates being exposed to the different culture, and we're actually looking forward to it. Then eventually, the honeymoon is over. We get involved in what we might call the disenchantment stage, where we recognize the reality of the new setting. We begin to encounter some difficulties because, it's not exactly like what we thought it was going to be. And adaptation and communication problems begin to emerge. Because sometimes change, as we all know, isn't easy. Well, when we move into a new culture, we're talking about complete change, aren't we? Eventually, we get into what we call the adjustment stage. The one who journeys into the new culture then gains some cultural insight. They begin to understand. They gradually begin to make some adjustments, perhaps some modifications, and develop some coping skills and begin to cope much more with their new surroundings. And finally, the next stage, the effective functioning stage. We begin to understand the key elements of the new culture. How does it work? What are the customs? What are the acceptable behaviors? What are the communication patterns? And the communication patterns are probably what's most important. And you will often hear me say, when we start talking about communication and culture, you cannot really define one without really having a good understanding of the other, because they're so entirely ingrained and enmeshed in each other. And with that effective functioning stage, we also begin then to feel comfortable in our surroundings. And the whole idea of being with, that whole cycle of culture shock hopefully ends in us understanding what it is we're doing here, why we're here, and where we're going. So functioning in a new culture, what does it take? We need to learn about the language of our host culture, don't we? How are the people around us communicating? Are we able to communicate with them? We need to guard against ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism, the idea that our way is the right way, and that everyone else is really doing it the wrong way. Therein lies a problem, because there are many ways of doing an awful lot of things. And to listen to anyone tell you that this is the way, and there are no ways that are acceptable after that, is dangerous talk, because it sets you up to be an adversary to an awful lot of people in the world. We need to learn about the host culture, but indeed we need to work to maintain our own culture, don't we? Because there are things we need to accept and we need to deal with and adopt and adapt in which to operate smoothly within that society, to navigate that society. But more than likely one would never be happy if one gave up completely one's own heritage and one's own culture. So ethical considerations that we need to consider. Ethics can be seen as a reflection of your convictions, which, believe it or not, are rooted in your culture. Because oftentimes your convictions might vary from culture to culture. Your values might vary from culture to culture, based on oftentimes survival and how the culture with which you grew up and became most familiar with and are most comfortable with actually learned to survive and navigate with each other's society. Ethics provide guidelines that influence the manner in which you communicate with other people. When is it acceptable, for example, to lie? And I know some of you might actually be thinking when I just say something like that, never! It's never acceptable to lie. Well, that may not necessarily be the case, because depending upon how you define lies, for instance, is it acceptable to lie to somebody as you're taking them to their surprise birthday party? Many people in most societies would say, sure. And other people would say, well, that's not really a lie. Now we're starting to draw hairs, split hairs. So, okay. And ethics helps you to determine what you ought to do, right? How you ought to act, and how you should interact with other people. What's ethical, what's right? So what are the common ethical perspectives? The first is fundamentalism. Suggests that timeless moral truths are rooted in human nature and independent of the conventions of particular societies. Timeless moral truths rooted in human nature and independent of conventions of particular societies. Those who take a fundamentalist approach will suggest that they have the key to the definitive moral rules and codes that should apply to all people and all times, regardless of what any of those other people really believe. That's fundamentalism. Relativism. Here we are deciding what is right or wrong, and good and bad. This behavior is not absolute, but it is changeable and it is relative, depending upon the circumstances and the situation you find yourself in. Ethical principles are culturally bound, and they might change, of course, from culture to culture. they're context dependent. What's that situation? What's that circumstance? And they're only applicable to their respective cultures. They're only applicable to the respective cultures. Relativism. So one of the things that we need to pay attention to is the idea of being mindful in communication. Not everybody is going to think the same way you do. Not everybody is going to think the same way I do. And that depending upon the culture in which you grew up and that you've become most familiar, depending upon your own independent thinking as to whether or not as you've grown up you've accepted your particular culture and all the aspects of it or not, or have chosen to go a different path, we need to be mindful of others. And in so doing, we need to show respect for others. We need to search for commonalities as we start looking at how do I survive in a multicultural world and survive with the idea of communicating with each other interculturally. We need to be respectful of cultural differences. Ethnocentrism is a very dangerous stance. It leads to zealotism and oftentimes leads to very extreme behavior. We need to accept responsibility for our behavior and recognize that there are other people involved and that there are other people around us. So what are the challenges that we face when we deal with intercultural communication? The first one is individual uniqueness, as I've already alluded to. No two people are exactly alike. Behaviors are shaped by multiple sources. Media, church, the social groups with which we interact, government, school, our families. Those multiple sources can go on and on. We also need to understand that we indeed are more than our own culture. We are human beings who are individual and unique and cannot be defined solely by the culture from which we came. We need to acknowledge the fact that we indeed know how to think for ourselves, and we should acknowledge that we ought to give everyone the right to do so. So, generalizations, another challenge. We should view cultural generalizations as approximations, not absolute representations. Cultural generalizations. When we know something overall about the culture, we can also figure when we meet somebody from that particular culture that they may generally respond this way, but not absolutely. Generalizations should deal with primary values and behaviors of a particular culture. Don't apply them to unique individuals. We should use those that can be supported by a variety of sources. You've only heard a particular generalization about a particular culture from somebody who is an ethnocentrist next to you who told you a bad joke. I wouldn't give it any credence whatsoever, and neither should you. Conclusions and statements about culture should be qualified so that they do not appear to be absolutes, but only cautious generalizations, which is what they are. Objectivity is another challenge. Can anyone really be objective? I suggest to you that that's nearly impossible, because we look through our own worldview eyes and we look at things from the lens of the culture from which we grew up, and we're always doing comparisons, aren't we? Objectivity can be difficult. The state of being objective, just, unbiased, and not influenced by emotions or personal prejudices, very tough. Objectivity means you approach each new situation with an open mind and avoid being too judgmental. Is that possible? It's an ideal that is admirable to strive for. It's very difficult. But we need to keep an open mind in order to do that and to be objective. So as we start looking into the beginning of our discussion of intercultural communication, understanding is the key. So if you're going along on this journey with me through this series of discussions on intercultural communication, let me just say, part of our initial bit here and what we're doing here is to understand we do have open minds and not approach intercultural communication within a multicultural world, heck, within our own cultural communities, with that idea that we must be right, and I'm only looking to understand so that I can change other people's minds. Wrong. Let's start and stop right there at understanding. That's what we're here for. Again, my name is Dr. Mike Searcy, and I'm the president of Communication Resource Consulting and professor of Communication Studies. I'd like to thank you for spending some time with us talking a little bit about intercultural communication, and this is part one. Thank you.